So for my final project, I'm going to talk about the monumental court case known as Brown versus Topeka Board of Education, which resulted in groundbreaking legislation that declared separate but equal schooling, as it had been derived from the 1896 case Plessy versus Ferguson, to be unconstitutional. So not only did Brown end school segregation by law, but it also promoted integrating our schools. Around the time of the Brown decision, the civil rights movement was gaining a great deal of momentum, and the issue of racial equality was certainly one that was at the forefront of social, political, and educational debate. So it all began in 1950 when Linda Brown, then 8 years old, was denied entry to her local neighborhood school that was about 10 minutes from her home, and instead expected to walk and wait for a bus that would take her to an all-black school much further from her home. Often she would be waiting in rain, in snow, and cold weather. The bus would be late, or they would arrive to the school before it opened, and her father, Oliver Brown, saw this as a complete injustice and began fighting for his daughter's right to attend her local neighborhood school. The case was eventually picked up by the NAACP, and by the time it reached the Supreme Court, it was heard in conjunction with 4 other cases that spanned 4 states and the District of Columbia, and the case had picked up a great deal of plaintiffs as well. Each of the cases that was heard in conjunction with Brown had been presented in district courts and asserted that school segregation was unconstitutional, but in each of these cases the courts had upheld school segregation, citing Plessy versus Ferguson, in that so long as the separate schools were deemed equal, that no constitutional rights were being violated. So the major challenge of the anti-segregation forces led by Thurgood Marshall in the Supreme Court case was to prove that separate but equal schooling was in fact inherently unequal, and Plessy versus Ferguson needed to be revoked. And the court ultimately did agree, and in 1954 they handed down a decision that announced segregation is a denial of the equal protection of the laws. So Plessy versus Ferguson was renounced, and victory had been achieved by all of those who had been persistently fighting for integrating schools for years. So what does this mean for us today? Well, while Brown was groundbreaking in that it led the way for integrating our schools and outlawing school segregation, because of de facto segregation, we can see there still exists a separation in our schools amongst races. So often the problem is that, based on de facto segregation, many groups live in certain areas as a result of socioeconomic status or even race, and it's often inner city, low income areas that are concentrated by minorities and have the schools that are under-resourced, underfunded, and lacking in materials, lacking in teacher quality, and are even held in dilapidated facilities. So what I can do as a teacher in my discipline would be to help certain problems, such as the lack of library books in some of these schools, or try to increase the number of students that are performing up to their grade level standards in reading and writing, and also include more multicultural text in the curriculum. So in order to address these problems, I would set up tutoring programs among students where they would go back and forth to each other's schools, possibly supervised by adults or parents or adults in the communities, which also adds a dimension of civic engagement that could hopefully be modeled by the students in the future. Also setting up a book drive that would start with my class and then extend to other classes, the school, and even the community on the whole. If we can get local businesses to allow us to put a drop box in their stores so patrons can put books in that we would donate to a school or community library in need of resources. Also a program that would have my students going out into other schools where perhaps parents don't have time to read to their children. They have excessive work hours, or the local library has closed down and students don't have access to books. So I would have my students go out and actually read to younger children in order to hopefully incite an interest in literature, or at least increase their understanding and appreciation for it in the future. And finally, I would also like to take a play that we would be reading in our English class and actually put it on in the community, and possibly in conjunction with another class from another school in a district unlike our own, so that the students are getting a chance to interact with a diverse group of people that they may not interact with on a daily basis, and learn, have fun, and also develop that mutual respect and understanding for each other. And so we can see that Brown has brought us a long way in the 50 plus years since the ruling as far as equality among races. However, there still exists a disparity in schooling as far as inner cities versus suburban, and the groups that are typically associated with living in such districts.